Atlanta, Georgia, 1992. The streets were quieter than they are today, the rhythm of daily life slower, yet no less fragile. In one suburban neighborhood, a family's ordinary evening was about to shift into a nightmare that would stretch across decades. 15-year-old Rachel Whitfield left home that afternoon, the kind of teenager who still had more questions than answers about life, yet carried herself with a brightness that everyone around her noticed. Friends describe her as sharp, determined, always quick to laugh. That laughter would be silenced before the night was over. Her parents, Silas and Alara, expected her to walk through the door before dinner, her younger brother waiting to tease her about who called the house phone this time. Instead, the hours slipped by. Calls went unanswered. Her usual haunts turned up nothing. The Whitfields' search for their daughter began as the sun went down, not knowing that this night would mark the start of 30 years of uncertainty. Rachel never saw the danger coming. Most people don't. If you're not subscribed, how will you stay alert when the next story like this unfolds? Hit subscribe now, and if you choose not to, tell us in the comments why you'd rather stay unprepared. Neighbors later recalled that Rachel's absence felt unusual from the very beginning. She wasn't the type to wander off without a word, nor was she careless about letting her family know where she'd be. That's why the silence of that evening carried a weight that was difficult to explain. At first, her parents held on to the hope that she had simply lost track of time, maybe caught up in a school project or chatting with a friend. But by nightfall, when the phone rang and it wasn't her, the first threads of dread began to tighten. In 1992, families didn't have the safety net of cell phones or social media check-ins. A missing child meant waiting by a landline, calling friends one by one, and driving through darkened streets with headlights, cutting through uncertainty. For the Whitfields, the hours grew longer, the silence heavier, until a simple truth could no longer be ignored. Rachel was gone. By midnight, the Whitfields had already retraced every step they believed Rachel might have taken. Friends' houses, the corner store, even the nearby park, all offered nothing but silence. Each unanswered knock on a door deepened the sinking realization that something was terribly wrong. When the police finally arrived, their questions were straightforward but heavy. When was she last seen? Did she ever run away before? Was there trouble at home? Silas and Alara answered firmly. This wasn't a child trying to escape rules or teenage boredom. This was different. Rachel had vanished, and with her disappearance, the fragile sense of safety in their neighborhood began to crack. What made her absence even more chilling was the lack of signs. No forced entry, no struggle, no clear witness who could say they saw her after dusk. It was as though she had stepped into the shadows and never returned. It took only one evening for the Whitfields' world to collapse. If this happened in your neighborhood, would you be ready to recognize the signs? Subscribe now so you won't be the one caught off guard. And if you still refuse, write in the comments why you'd rather take that risk. Rachel Whitfield was 15 and not yet defined by the labels other people would give her. She argued points at debate club with a seriousness that surprised her classmates, swam laps with a quiet competitiveness, and loved Saturday mornings at the public library where she devoured books on topics from civil rights to classic novels. Her teachers called her attentive. Her friends called her honest. At family dinners, she often sat between her parents and laughed the loudest. She kept a modest journal, filled with to-do lists and small plans. College essays half-started, a list of songs she wanted to learn on the guitar. People who knew her remember a steadiness that felt older than her years, a steady gaze, the habit of showing up. That steady presence is part of what made her disappearance so hard to accept. When someone who reliably shows up doesn't, the absence becomes sharper than any question. Rachel had plans, a circle that expected her next steps. Those plans stopped the evening she didn't come home. Silas and Alara Whitfield ran a household that was loud in the best ways. The clack of cereal bowls at breakfast, the radio on low during dinner prep, a string of school awards on the hallway shelf. Silas worked at the city water department. Alara taught at a community college. They were practical people who believed in lists, schedules, and check-ins, the small routines that keep a family anchored. Their younger son, Kellen, was 12 when Rachel vanished, old enough to remember the details of family rituals and young enough for those rituals to mean everything. Their house was the kind that held history in drawers, a library of school photos, a stack of birthday cards, a pile of recipes scribbled on index cards. It was not a wealthy home, but it was a steady one. The Whitfields prized trust in neighbors and the idea that community could be counted on, that faith would be tested. The ordinary rhythms of that home, the way Rachel's sneakers were left by the back door, the school jacket folded on a hook, suddenly felt like proof of someone missing. The year 1992 shaped how a missing person case would unfold. People relied on landlines, payphones, and answering machines. If someone didn't come home, families called every number they had, drove to friends' houses, and stapled printed flyers on telephone poles and storefront windows. Local TV and radio still mattered. News reports were scheduled and watched. There were no quick location pings, no social posts to check a last-seen location. The days between a disappearance and a public alert could stretch longer than what we expect today. Neighborhoods felt private then. People left doors unlocked more often. Kids played later because a parent's voice from the porch would call them in. That sense of everyday trust is important to remember. Communities were close, but the tools for quick, wide sharing of information simply didn't exist. Those limits affected not just how the Whitfields searched for Rachel, but how quickly others could join them. Rachel's schedule was straightforward: school, debate meetings twice a week, swim practice, and Saturdays with a local part-time job at a small bookstore. She knew the streets near her home and the people who lived on them. The day she disappeared started like any other. She left the house that afternoon intending to visit a friend, a quick stop to swap notes for an upcoming project, and then a detour to the bookstore to pick up a new paperback. Later that evening, she was expected home for dinner. The last confirmed sighting came from a neighbor who waved as Rachel walked past on her way to a friend's house. No one expected that wave to be the last. Small, routine details, a backpack left on a porch bench, a book not returned to its shelf, later became questions investigators would ask. At the time, they were simply parts of an ordinary day. When Rachel didn't return, the Whitfields' routine turned into a search pattern. Friends and neighbors gathered at dusk to call out names. Flyers were printed and handed out. Local churches offered space for community meetings. The absence filled rooms, a jacket hanging on a chair, a half-eaten meal cooling on the kitchen table. For Kellen, the missing pieces became a kind of private ache he carried as he moved through middle school and then high school. The house that had held steady rhythms now felt frozen in the moment before everything changed. Neighbors who had once waved from porches stood silently at the curb. Conversations shifted from everyday gossip to lists of where Rachel might have gone. People compared notes, who had seen her, who hadn't. The case wasn't just the Whitfields' problem anymore. It touched the whole neighborhood. That shared attention brought comfort at first, but it could not replace the missing person at the center of it. What would you have done in Silas and Alara's place when the evening stretched and the phone stayed silent? Think of your own child disappearing with no device to call for help and no quick way to broadcast their last known location. Would you want every possible alert and every available lead? That small difference, being informed in time, can change how quickly people mobilize, how many neighbors look out windows, how many sets of eyes join a search. Subscribe to this channel so you won't be the one saying later, "If I had known sooner, I could have helped." Stay connected to stories that warn, teach, and keep attention where it matters. If you decide not to subscribe, tell us in the comments why you're choosing not to. Your reasons matter to this conversation, and we'll read them. By the time the clock struck 10 p.m., Rachel still hadn't returned. Dinner plates had cooled, the hallway lights stayed on, and Silas paced from the front door to the driveway, scanning the empty street. Alara dialed every number she could think of. Rachel's friends, their parents, even the bookstore where she sometimes stopped by. Each call ended the same way. No one had seen her. When the neighbors heard the Whitfields outside calling Rachel's name, several stepped out to help. Flashlights cut across lawns, cars crawled down neighborhood roads, yet every corner they turned came up empty. The family dog, normally restless when Rachel was gone too long, lay silent by the door as though sensing something was wrong. The first night stretched into a kind of vigil. Silas refused to go inside, convinced Rachel might still walk up the driveway at any moment. Ilara sat on the front steps with the phone cradled in her hands, waiting for it to ring. That night's silence was heavier than anything they had known, the kind of silence that turns minutes into hours. When the call to police was finally made, the response began with routine questions. Was Rachel upset about anything? Had there been arguments at home? Did she ever stay over at friends' houses without telling her parents? Silas and Ilara insisted, no, this wasn't her. Rachel was punctual, respectful, and had never once stayed away without permission. Detective Elias Vance was the first to take charge. He had worked missing person cases before and knew the importance of the early hours. Alongside him was Officer Lena Diaz, younger, determined, and sharp-eyed. They walked through the Whitfield home, noting Rachel's belongings, the backpack by her desk, the shoes she wore most days left untouched in her closet. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave. The officers spoke with neighbors, marking times and places. A woman named Anya remembered seeing Rachel pass her garden around 5 o'clock. Another neighbor recalled a wave, nothing unusual. Beyond that, the trail seemed to vanish. Elias ordered a canvass of the area, house to house questioning, checking local businesses. By morning, the case had already gathered weight. In the first week, suspicion shifted constantly. Rachel's ex-boyfriend Marcus quickly drew attention. They had ended things months earlier, but teenagers don't always part without lingering feelings. Detectives questioned him twice, noting his nervous answers and shifting explanations about where he had been that evening. Rumors spread in the school hallways, and Marcus became the easy villain in whispered conversations. Yet his alibi held. He had been at a family gathering, verified by several relatives. Another name surfaced, Gideon, the reclusive neighbor who rarely spoke to anyone. His yard was overgrown, his windows always covered. Some swore they saw him walking near the intersection where Rachel was last spotted. Police searched his property, finding only clutter and old newspapers stacked to the ceiling. Nothing linked him to Rachel. Others pointed to a stranger in a parked car that week, described vaguely as a man in his 30s. Leads poured in, each one adding urgency but no resolution. For every theory, there was a dead end. The neighborhood buzzed with suspicion, but suspicion without evidence is a fragile thing. By the second week, Rachel's photo was everywhere, stapled to wooden poles, taped to store windows, posted in church lobbies. Her face stared out from black and white photocopies with the word "missing" bold at the top. Each flyer carried hope, yet each passing day made that hope harder to hold. Local news stations picked up the story. Anchors described her as a promising student from a respected family. Volunteers organized search parties, combing wooded trails and vacant lots. Each time they set out, the Whitfields waited by the phone for good news that never came. The attention wasn't always helpful. Rumors swirled, whispers of runaway theories, dark speculation about family secrets. Every false story added to the Whitfields' pain. Ilara began avoiding the grocery store because she couldn't stand overhearing strangers weigh in on her daughter's life as though it were casual gossip. For the community, Rachel's absence was no longer just a private family tragedy. It had become a shared wound, one that no one could close. Weeks turned to months. The flyers yellowed in the sun and curled at the edges from rain. Search parties dwindled as energy gave way to exhaustion. The detectives kept at it, but each promising lead thinned out. A witness would change their story, a tip would prove false, a test would show nothing. Silas and Ilara still set the dinner table for 4, a gesture of refusal to accept the void. Kellen avoided the empty chair, instead eating quietly in his room. The Whitfields attended every community meeting, asking the same questions everyone was afraid to answer. Where is Rachel? Why hasn't anyone come forward? Detective Elias pushed until there was nothing left to push. The files grew thicker, the evidence drawer stayed thin. Eventually, the case was shelved. Officially, it was unsolved. Unofficially, the Whitfields carried it every day. Rachel's photo faded on posters, and with it, hope. Yet, what no one realized was that a single overlooked detail, a minor scrap of evidence boxed away, would eventually bring everything back to light. Decades later, with technology no one in 1992 could have imagined, the truth hidden in that fragment would speak louder than all the rumors combined. The story of Rachel Whitfield did not end in 1992. It lingered, waiting for the right tools and the right people to see what had been missed. If this happened in your town, wouldn't you want to know first? Subscribe now so you're not the last to hear when justice finally breaks through. Still not subscribing? Comment why. You may convince someone else. Years passed, but the Whitfield home remained frozen in the evening. Rachel vanished. Her bedroom was never packed away. Posters stayed on the walls. School notebooks lined her desk, and a sweater she had left on her chair remained folded exactly as she had left it. Friends who visited described the room as a shrine, a quiet attempt to hold on to a life that had slipped away too quickly. Silas kept mowing the lawn, fixing small things around the house and paying the bills, but those tasks felt mechanical. Ilara, once full of energy from teaching, slowly withdrew from colleagues and friends. Holidays became quieter. Birthdays passed with candles lit for someone who never came home. Every photo of Rachel, smiling in swim gear, holding a trophy, standing with classmates, felt both comforting and unbearable. For the Whitfields, grief was not an event. It became their atmosphere, shaping everything they did. The house was full, yet it carried an absence that pressed on every corner. Detective Elias Vance retired in the late 1990s. Colleagues remembered him as the kind of man who never truly closed a file if it lacked resolution. Though his badge was turned in, the Whitfield case followed him everywhere. Boxes of old evidence sat in his garage, stacked neatly, as if he expected one day to return to them. In his quiet hours, Elias would sit with the case notes spread across his dining table, replaying interviews in his mind. He wrote margins filled with questions that had no answers. Why did Rachel disappear in such a narrow window of time? Who had opportunity but escaped scrutiny? Could a single overlooked detail explain everything? His wife sometimes urged him to let it go for the sake of peace. But for Elias, letting go felt like betrayal. He carried the memory of the Whitfields' faces on that first night, Silas pacing in the driveway, Ilara clutching the phone. And it never left him. Retirement gave him time, but time only deepened his determination. While Elias wrestled with the case as an investigator, Rachel's younger brother Kellen lived with it as family. He grew from a boy into a man under the shadow of a sister who was never found. In high school, when classmates asked about his family, he hesitated. People either whispered with pity or avoided the subject altogether. That silence carved into him more than cruel words ever could. Kellen tried to build a normal life, finishing school, working part-time jobs, later attending college. But everywhere he went, the absence of Rachel followed. Her empty chair at graduations, her missing voice in family gatherings, the milestones she never reached, all reminders that he carried a story without an ending. As he grew older, Kellen began to visit Elias. They would sit together, reviewing old files, speaking quietly about what might have happened. For Kellen, these visits were less about finding quick answers and more about refusing to let his sister be forgotten. Rachel wasn't just a name in a cold case file. She was his sister, and he wanted her remembered as more than a headline. In the early 2000s, retired Elias and grown-up Kellen took turns examining the evidence that had gathered dust for years. They found small things that once seemed trivial. A vague phone call reported by a neighbor, a description of a car that didn't match anyone local, and a necklace Rachel was said to have worn that was never recovered. For years, these details felt like loose threads. None of them connected into a clear pattern, but as they looked back, Both Elias and Kellen sensed there might be meaning hidden in those fragments. It wasn't that the evidence had changed, it was that perspective had. At the same time, police departments across the country were beginning to adopt new technologies. DNA testing, once limited and expensive, was becoming more precise. Items once stored away as useless, hair, fibers, partial fingerprints, were being re-examined with new tools. In many jurisdictions, unsolved cases from the early 1990s were quietly being reopened. The Whitfield case sat waiting, its evidence sealed in boxes. The hope that had dimmed for a decade flickered again, fragile but alive. By the late 2000s, Detective Lena Diaz, who had once been the junior officer on the case, now held a leadership position. She carried with her not just professional responsibility, but a personal drive. The memory of Rachel's missing person posters still vivid in her mind. When advancements in forensic testing became available, Lena pushed to review cold files that had haunted the department. Among them was the Whitfield case. A small fragment of evidence, overlooked in the early years, was sent for testing. What once was an item too degraded for analysis now carried potential. The results weren't immediate, but they offered something the Whitfields hadn't had in years, a reason to believe. Decades had passed, yet the chance to learn the truth felt closer than ever. For Silas and Alara, the possibility reopened wounds, but also stirred hope. For Elias, it felt like vindication for refusing to let the file fade. For Kellen, it meant the question that defined his life might finally have an answer. Decades had slipped by before science was finally ready to speak. Think about that. 30 years of waiting, while families carried grief and investigators carried doubts. How many more families are out there right now, waiting for answers locked inside evidence that hasn't yet been tested? Cold cases are not just files gathering dust. They are voices waiting for the right moment to be heard. The Whitfield story shows that even after years, the truth can return, but only if people stay aware, only if stories are not forgotten. Decades passed before science spoke up. How many more cold cases are waiting? Subscribe so you don't miss the ones that could change how you see safety forever. And if you'd rather risk ignorance, drop your reason in the comments. The Whitfield case file had grown thick with interviews and false leads, but the physical evidence sat quietly in sealed envelopes. Among the items was a piece of Rachel's clothing collected the night she vanished. For years it had been labeled unhelpful. The technology simply wasn't advanced enough. Now, in the late 2000s, that same item carried new potential. When forensic analysts applied modern DNA testing to the fibers, they pulled a partial profile. It was faint, incomplete by earlier standards, but under improved methods, it was enough. The sample was entered into national databases that had not existed in 1992. For the first time in decades, the silence broke. Within weeks, a hit came back. The name wasn't Marcus, Gideon, or any of the suspects whose names filled the early files. It belonged to someone no one had considered at all. That shock would soon ripple through the community. The result identified a man named Tristan Hale. He was in his 40s now, living a respectable life not far from where the Whitfields still resided. Tristan worked as a small business owner, known for sponsoring local sports teams and volunteering at church events. Neighbors described him as polite, helpful, and reliable. His name had never appeared in the original investigation. He wasn't part of Rachel's close circle, nor was he ever questioned in 1992. Yet the DNA said otherwise. A trace on Rachel's clothing connected him to the night she disappeared. For investigators, the revelation was jarring. How could someone so deeply woven into the fabric of the community carry such a hidden link? Detective Lena Diaz, who now led the case, felt the weight of what this discovery meant. It wasn't just about solving a file long labeled cold. It was about confronting the reality that danger can live unnoticed, even celebrated, within ordinary neighborhoods. With Tristan's name in hand, investigators began tracing back through history. At first, the connection to Rachel seemed thin. He wasn't a teacher at her school, not a relative, not a neighbor. but digging deeper revealed smaller, quieter links. Rachel's mother, Alara, taught part-time at a community college in the early 1990s. Records showed that Tristan, a young man at the time, had briefly enrolled in evening courses there. He wasn't a standout student, but he had crossed paths with Alara more than once. Investigators speculated whether this connection had placed Rachel within his awareness. Other fragments emerged. A friend of Rachel's recalled seeing Tristan at a local bookstore, one Rachel often visited. A neighbor remembered him passing through the area, though they never thought much of it then. None of these alone proved guilt, but together they painted a troubling picture. Tristan had been closer to Rachel's world than anyone realized. By 2010, Tristan was no longer the young man seen around campus. He was now a respected figure. He ran a hardware store that had become a local fixture, employed several teenagers, and sponsored community fairs. He was married, with children, and often spoke at local events about safety and responsibility. To most, he embodied trust. Yet behind the image of reliability, investigators uncovered inconsistencies. His timeline in 1992 had never been checked, simply because no one suspected him. When Lena reviewed old employment records, she found unexplained gaps in his schedule. Financial statements showed unusual withdrawals during that summer, raising questions about where he had been spending time. Neighbors who once described him warmly now recalled moments that, in hindsight, felt unsettling. His tendency to ask casual but oddly specific questions about teenagers in the area, or the way he sometimes lingered near the high school grounds under the guise of running errands. The man celebrated for community spirit now stood as the central figure in a case that demanded answers. To move forward, investigators needed more than DNA. They needed to understand Tristan as he lived now. Lena assembled a small team to place him under surveillance. They followed his routines quietly, opening his store at dawn, meeting suppliers, chatting with customers. On the surface, everything seemed ordinary, but the closer they watched, the more cracks appeared. Tristan was careful, sometimes too careful. He took long detours on drives home, as though checking if someone followed. He shredded mail obsessively. He kept a locked cabinet in the back of his store, one that staff said only he accessed. These details, while small, gave investigators the sense of a man guarding secrets. They also began speaking discreetly with those who had known him in the past. An old acquaintance described him as charismatic, but controlling. A former girlfriend recalled sudden mood swings and a temper he hid from public view. Slowly, a second portrait emerged. Not the friendly shopkeeper, but a man with patterns of behavior that now raised red flags. Every night, Lena reviewed reports and felt the pressure mount. If Tristan was connected to Rachel's disappearance, 30 years of waiting demanded evidence strong enough to hold in court. The investigation had shifted. For the first time in decades, detectives weren't chasing rumors or faded memories. They were tracking a man whose DNA connected him to the case. What had once seemed like a puzzle with missing pieces was beginning to sharpen into focus. Still, there were risks. Tristan wasn't just any suspect. He was a community figure. An arrest without airtight proof could tear the neighborhood apart and leave the Whitfields facing disappointment once more. Surveillance continued, the pressure building with each day of observation. Behind the smiles he offered at church gatherings and the helpful handshakes at his store, the evidence suggested something darker. Investigators prepared themselves for the possibility that the truth was finally within reach, but the moment to act had to be chosen carefully. Most people don't know this, but it changes everything. If you aren't subscribed, you'll be the one left behind when the truth comes out. Subscribe now, and if not, own it. Type your reason in the comments. The day Tristan was taken into custody began like any other for him. He opened his hardware store just after sunrise, unlocking the doors and greeting early customers with the same practiced friendliness he had shown for years. To the public eye, nothing seemed unusual, yet outside, unmarked vehicles lingered, and plainclothes officers blended into the flow of morning shoppers. Detective Lena Diaz had chosen this setting deliberately. Arresting Tristan in public reduced the chance of confrontation behind closed doors and made it harder for him to escape or destroy evidence. When he stepped outside to load supplies into a customer's truck, officers moved in. The suddenness shocked bystanders. One moment Tristan was chatting casually, the next he was surrounded. His hands were pulled behind his back, cuffs clicking shut as Lena read his rights. People froze, bags of groceries in their hands, watching a man they thought they knew led away. Word spread within minutes, phones rang, whispers shot across the neighborhood. Tristan Hale has been arrested for Rachel Whitfield's disappearance. 30 years of questions had just collided with an answer few expected. The community erupted in disbelief. For years, Tristan had been the man who offered free repairs for local churches, donated equipment to school programs, and lent tools to neighbors without hesitation. To see him in handcuffs was unthinkable. Some refused to believe it. They argued that there must have been a mistake, that DNA evidence couldn't possibly outweigh decades of trust. Others felt betrayed, replaying every interaction with Tristan in a new, unsettling light. How could they have welcomed him into their homes, shaken his hand at gatherings, or trusted their children around him? For the Whitfields, the news landed differently. It wasn't relief yet, not until the evidence held in court, but it was a shift, the first sign that the silence surrounding Rachel's disappearance was breaking. Ilara sat at the kitchen table, hands trembling as she listened to the report. Silas, stoic for so long, allowed himself to whisper, "Finally." The arrest fractured the community's sense of certainty. Belief and doubt clashed in every conversation. As headlines spread, debates began almost immediately. Had law enforcement failed the Whitfields by not catching Tristan sooner? Some argued yes. After all, he lived among them the entire time, not hiding, but running a business, volunteering, even smiling for photos at local events. Should the early investigation have dug deeper, past the obvious suspects? Others defended the detectives, pointing out that in 1992, the tools simply weren't available. DNA testing was in its infancy. The match that exposed Tristan was only possible because of advancements that didn't exist then. Without that, he might never have been identified. The tension wasn't just about blame. It revealed how communities wrestle with hindsight. People asked themselves difficult questions. If I had noticed something unusual back then, would I have spoken up? Could any of us have seen what he truly was? In living rooms, coffee shops, and churches, the conversation became less about the man in custody and more about what his presence among them meant. A pillar of trust was now accused of shattering it. The past 30 years looked different under that knowledge. This wasn't a stranger lurking far away. This was a man who shook hands at fundraisers, who stood at the sidelines of youth games, who smiled from behind a store counter. For 3 decades, he was part of daily life, trusted and even admired. Now imagine what it feels like to realize that someone like Tristan lived in your own neighborhood without suspicion. Think about how many times people let their guard down simply because someone seemed familiar, respectable, or friendly. That assumption kept him hidden in plain sight for 30 years. This man lived among them for 30 years, trusted, respected. If you're not subscribed, what's stopping you from being blindsided by the next Tristan in your community? Subscribe or tell us in the comments why you won't. This isn't just a case about the past. It's about the present, too. Every community carries secrets. Every street has doors closed to outside eyes. When justice finally emerges, it's often too late for the victims. Don't wait until hindsight teaches you the lesson. Stay informed, stay aware, and stay connected. In the days following Tristan's arrest, detectives placed him in a stark interview room. For hours he denied involvement. He repeated that he barely remembered Rachel, that he had no reason to harm her. His voice was calm at first, measured, the same tone he once used to reassure customers in his store. But Lena Diaz had studied him carefully. She knew when his eyes darted to the floor instead of holding her gaze, when his hands tightened slightly against the table. Piece by piece she laid out the evidence, the DNA match, The timelines that no longer aligned, the accounts from people who remembered him near places he claimed never to have been. As the weight of the evidence pressed in, the calm began to crack. Silence stretched. His shoulders sagged and his words faltered. He asked for water, took long pauses, and finally whispered what investigators had waited 3 decades to hear. "It was me." The room was still for a moment before Lena asked him to continue. His confession opened a door no one wanted to step through, but everyone needed to hear. Tristan admitted he had noticed Rachel long before that night. He first saw her when visiting the bookstore where she sometimes worked weekends. He claimed it was innocent at first, describing her as polite, bright. But as he spoke, it became clear his interest had shifted into something darker. He described chance encounters, seeing her walk home from practice, noticing her outside her house. He said he began to think about her constantly, convincing himself these observations meant something more than they did. To investigators, it was chilling not because of dramatic details, but because of how ordinary his words were. He spoke of noticing, watching, waiting. On the evening Rachel vanished, Tristan admitted he saw her walking alone. He stopped his car under the pretense of offering a ride. What happened next, he described in fragmented sentences, often pausing, sometimes shaking his head. The words themselves revealed little of the violence, but enough for detectives to understand. Rachel never made it home because Tristan decided to act on an obsession that had grown unchecked. For 30 years, he had hidden behind normalcy, but the mask slipped the moment DNA exposed him. The motive wasn't a grand scheme or elaborate plan. It was far more unsettling, a fixation that Tristan allowed to fester until it dictated his actions. He described how he convinced himself Rachel was different, that she would understand him in ways others did not. This belief, twisted though it was, justified in his mind the attention he gave her. Psychologists, later reviewing the case, described it as a dangerous mix of entitlement and delusion. Tristan had convinced himself his feelings mattered more than Rachel's safety, more than her family's trust, more than the boundaries of right and wrong. That imbalance, the way he elevated his own desires above someone else's life, was what turned interest into a crime. What unsettled investigators most wasn't the confession itself, but how ordinary Tristan's reasoning sounded. There were no dramatic declarations, only quiet explanations that revealed a man who had lived decades appearing responsible while carrying an act of violence buried in his past. The line between community figure and predator turned out to be thinner than anyone wanted to believe. The man who donated to local charities and gave speeches about responsibility was the same man who admitted to taking Rachel's life because he believed his feelings gave him permission. When the confession ended, Lena stepped out of the room and let the weight of his words sink in. 3 decades of searching, speculating, and suffering had narrowed down to one undeniable truth. Rachel was gone because someone who looked ordinary, who blended in, decided his wants mattered more than her future. For the Whitfields, the confession brought no celebration. It confirmed what they feared but never fully knew. The answers they had waited for arrived, but they came wrapped in pain. Closure, if it could be called that, was complicated. A relief to finally know, but also a heartbreak that the story ended this way. For the community, the lesson was harsh. Tristan had lived among them, welcomed into their lives. He wasn't a stranger. He was someone who looked like everyone else. He looked like everyone else. That's what makes this terrifying. Subscribe so you don't miss stories that remind us danger doesn't wear a mask. And if you still won't subscribe, explain why in the comments. We're listening. The story of Tristan's confession is not just about the past. It's a reminder of the unseen dangers that can exist behind familiar faces, and the importance of staying alert even when everything appears safe. For Silas and Alara Whitfield, the years of uncertainty had been heavier than words could describe. They had spent nights pacing hallways, days fielding false tips, and decades living with the sound of a door that never opened. When Tristan confessed, it confirmed what they had suspected in their hearts, but could never prove. Closure didn't mean celebration. It meant finally having the truth they had begged for, though it came with the sting of finality. Ilara said privately to a friend that the hardest part wasn't hearing how her daughter had been taken. It was realizing that every holiday, every birthday, had passed, while the answer was sitting quietly in their own community. Silas, always the more restrained, told a reporter that at least the questions had ended. For Kellen, who had grown from a boy into a man in the shadow of Rachel's disappearance, the confession allowed him to finally speak of her without only speaking of loss. The Whitfields held a small service in Rachel's honor, not a funeral that had come years earlier, but a gathering to recognize that her story had been told. It was a moment of peace carved out of decades of pain. Detective Elias Vance, long retired, attended that service. He stood quietly in the back, listening as people spoke about Rachel's life. For him, the conclusion was not about triumph, but persistence. He had carried the file long after leaving the force, convinced that some cases could not be abandoned. The confession validated his years of refusal to let go, yet he admitted later it also weighed on him, knowing that the truth had been so close all along. Lena Diaz, now a seasoned detective, reflected differently. For her, the case was proof of why modern tools and relentless effort matter. She had been a junior officer when Rachel vanished, barely trusted with key responsibilities. 3 decades later, she had led the charge that delivered answers. To her, it was both a professional milestone and a personal one. She told reporters that Rachel's case taught her the most important lesson of her career, that persistence is not just about solving crimes, it's about restoring dignity to families who deserve to know the truth. Together, Elias and Lena embodied the arc of the investigation, one carrying memory into retirement, the other carrying determination into the future. For the community, the arrest and confession rewrote history. Streets they once thought safe now felt marked by a story they wished had never been real. Neighbors who had waved to Tristan outside his store wrestled with the knowledge that their trust had been misplaced. Yet in the aftermath, something else happened. Rachel's name returned to conversations, not just as the girl who vanished, but as the girl who had lived. At schools, teachers spoke of her debate wins and swim meets. At church, she was remembered not as a victim, but as a teenager with ambition and kindness. The community began to honor her memory in ways they had not for years. Local organizations organized scholarships in her name, meant for students who showed the same determination Rachel had shown. Murals went up, ensuring her face looked out not from faded photocopies, but from painted walls that celebrated her life. The reckoning was not just about Tristan's crime. It was about the community learning to confront the fact that trust can be misplaced, but remembrance can be powerful. Through memorials, Rachel's story became a reminder that even decades later, justice has a chance to rise. The Whitfield case became more than a story of a crime solved. It was a lesson in endurance, for families who refused to give up, for detectives who refused to stop searching, and for communities that must face the truths hidden in their own neighborhoods. It underscored a broader truth. Time does not erase what is hidden. The years may dull memories, but the evidence remains, waiting for the right moment to speak. Rachel's story proved that silence can break, and when it does, the truth has a way of resurfacing no matter how much time has passed. Her name, once whispered in grief, is now spoken with recognition. Her story, once a painful mystery, is now a reminder of why persistence matters. We've all seen cases like this, but this one was different. Subscribe and stand with us, so Rachel's story and others like it are never forgotten. If you don't, tell us in the comments why you'd rather walk away from the memory. Rachel Whitfield was more than a missing person. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Her life mattered, and now her memory continues through every retelling, a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied. The confession was supposed to be the end of the story, but for the Whitfields, it was only the end of the search. The grief did not fade just because the truth finally had a name. If anything, the confession deepened it. because now they knew that for 30 years the answers had been out there, just hidden behind a neighbor's familiar face. Silas, always a man of routine, found himself replaying memories that had gathered dust. He remembered Rachel's smile at the dinner table, the way she tapped her pencil when she studied. Every memory was a reminder not only of what he lost, but of what Tristan had stolen. For years he had mowed the lawn, gone to work, and returned to the same quiet house. Now he could finally put a name to the silence that haunted every room. Ilara, once the teacher who inspired her students with energy, carried her sorrow more privately. She had grown accustomed to whispers in grocery aisles, to the sideways glances that said, "That's the mother of the missing girl." When the confession came, she allowed herself to speak more freely, not of Rachel's disappearance, but of her life, her favorite books, her stubborn streak, the way she loved fiercely even in small things. Ilara said in an interview, "For 30 years I was afraid to tell stories about her because all anyone wanted to ask was about the case. Now, finally, I can talk about her as my daughter." Kellen's journey was different still. He was a boy when Rachel vanished, and he grew up with her absence defining his adolescence. School events, holidays, milestones, all haunted by an empty chair. As a man, he had built his life in the shadow of a question. When Tristan confessed, Kellen admitted he felt both relief and rage. Relief because the mystery was over. Rage because he realized that while he grew up searching for closure, Tristan grew up free, respected, trusted. He lived his life, Kellen said bitterly. Rachel never got to live hers. Detective Elias Vance's reflection came with age. He had retired long before the case was solved, but he never abandoned it. For him, persistence had been both a burden and a calling. He said, "When I saw Tristan in cuffs, I thought of every long night I spent looking at that file, wondering if I'd missed something. And I had. We all had. But technology caught what I couldn't." His honesty resonated with the Whitfields. They knew he had carried Rachel's case like his own grief. Detective Lena Diaz, by then a leader in her department, felt vindicated in her decision to reopen the case when DNA technology advanced. She had been the rookie when Rachel disappeared, barely trusted to take notes at the scene. 30 years later, she was the one who placed cuffs on Tristan. For her, the lesson was simple. Persistence and patience matter, but so does progress. This case shows that we can't give up, not when science is still moving forward, she told the press. Beyond the family and the investigators, the community itself was shaken. For decades they had trusted Tristan. He sold them tools, donated to their schools, shook their hands at events. They had let him into their lives without hesitation. When he confessed, many felt a collective guilt, not because they could have stopped him, but because they had never suspected him. How could someone so ordinary commit something so devastating? That question echoed in every street, in every gathering. The somber reflection of Rachel's journey is that her life was cut short not by a stranger, but by someone who looked like everyone else. Her family lived decades with unanswered questions. Her community lived decades with misplaced trust, and her case became a symbol of how long truth can take to surface. Yet through it all, Rachel was not erased. She was remembered. In her family's home, her room was kept. In Elias's garage, her case files waited. In Lena's memory, her missing person poster never faded. And now, in her community, her name is spoken with respect, not just as a victim, but as a daughter, a sister, and a young woman who deserved more. Her story does not end with Tristan's confession. It ends with the truth finally being spoken, and the reminder that time does not silence justice, it only delays it. Rachel's case may have ended with a confession, but it left behind questions too heavy to fade. Questions that stretched beyond the Whitfield's home, beyond the courtroom, and into the conscience of anyone who followed her story. The first question many asked was simple but piercing. Is justice delayed, still justice served? For the Whitfields, the answer came in fragments. Silas believed it was, because the truth was finally spoken aloud. "We know now," he told a local paper. "That matters. It matters more than people think." He had lived 30 years in the dark. For him, light at last was something to hold on to. Elara, though, had a different answer. She admitted quietly that while the confession was a relief, it would never be justice in her eyes. Justice would have been Rachel living her life. Justice would have been her walking through the door that night in 1992. What we have now is truth, but it's not justice. That tension between truth and justice lingers in every cold case solved years later. Families are grateful for answers, but the years lost cannot be given back. The joy of resolution is always braided with the grief of lost time, and that grief brings forward another debate. Should cold cases always remain open until solved? From a law enforcement perspective, resources are finite. New crimes occur every day, demanding time, money, and attention. Some argue that focusing endlessly on the past risks leaving present victims unprotected. But Rachel's case forces us to ask, what is the cost of closing a file? Elias Vance, the retired detective, had carried Rachel's case long after he left the force. For him, the answer was clear. No case should be left to dust. He said in an interview, "The moment you close a case, you close the chance for truth." Families like the Whitfields don't stop grieving because the file is put in storage. His words reflect the anguish of families who live with permanent questions and the hope that even a small chance at answers is worth preserving. Lena Diaz, though equally determined, acknowledged the strain. There are thousands of cases, each one matters, but we have to balance the hope of solving the past with the urgency of protecting today's communities. What Rachel's case proves is that science can rewrite possibilities. That's why we need to invest in technology, to make every case solvable, not just some. For the audience, these questions are not theoretical. They are personal. Viewers who watch Rachel's story are forced to reflect. If your sister vanished in 1992, would you want her file closed after 3 years? Would you want investigators to say it was too late, too cold, too distant? Or would you want them to keep going, even if it took 30 years? These are the debates worth bringing into the comments, not just because they matter to the story, but because they matter to communities everywhere. If this were your family, would you accept silence after a few years, or would you demand persistence, no matter the cost? Subscribe so you don't look away from cases like Rachel's, and if you still won't, write in the comments. Tell us why you'd be willing to walk away. The audience is not just a viewer here, they are part of the conversation. By subscribing, by engaging, by sharing their thoughts, they shape the way these stories are remembered. Every comment asking, "Was justice served?" or "Should the case have stayed open?" is another reminder that Rachel's name is not lost to time. Beyond Rachel's case, the debate touches on something universal. How do we measure justice? Is it in the courtroom when the guilty confess? Is it in the community when memory is preserved? Or is it in the persistence of those who refuse to let a name fade into silence? For some, justice delayed is better than justice denied. For others, justice delayed is only half a victory. Neither answer is complete, but both are necessary for the discussion to continue. The Whitfield story demands that we wrestle with these contradictions. It does not offer easy answers, it offers the truth, and the truth is complex. So we ask you directly, do you think justice delayed is still justice served? Should cold cases always remain open until solved? Or should resources move on to the present? Drop your answers below. Your perspective might change how someone else sees Rachel's case, or even how future cases are handled. Rachel's case did more than solve a decades-old mystery. It left behind lessons that stretch far beyond one family, one community, and one courtroom. The community believed they knew Tristan. He sold them tools, volunteered at events, waved from his front yard. Parents sent their children into his shop without hesitation. When his name surfaced as the suspect, the shock wasn't only about his guilt, It was about how invisible he had been all along. Rachel's story forces us to face an uncomfortable truth. Danger doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it blends in, hides in plain sight, and earns trust before breaking it. For viewers, this is not just a historical detail. It's a reminder about our own lives, our own neighborhoods. Who do we trust without question? Who do we overlook because they appear ordinary? Rachel's case asks us to stay aware, not paranoid, but prepared. If Elias had not carried the case long into retirement, if Lena had not reopened it when DNA testing advanced, if Kellen had not kept his sister's name alive, the truth might still be hidden. Persistence was the quiet hero of this case. It did not come from one person, but from many, each refusing in their own way to let Rachel be forgotten. This is a lesson about endurance, about the power of refusing to give up even when years stretch into decades. It tells us that persistence, even in the face of silence, can change everything. For years, evidence sat useless, waiting for technology to catch up. The fibers, the fingerprints, the overlooked details, all waiting for a future where science could speak more clearly. Rachel's case proves that DNA is not just a tool, it is a voice. A voice for those who cannot speak, a voice that outlasts lies and silence. This lesson reaches beyond Rachel. It speaks to every unsolved case, every family still waiting. Advances in science are not abstract. They are lifelines. They are the reason truth can surface even when decades have passed. The Whitfields never stopped remembering Rachel. Her friends never stopped speaking her name. Even in silence, even in grief, they kept her alive in memory. That memory became power. It ensured the case was never just a file in a drawer. It was a living story, carried forward until justice finally came. For us, for the viewers, the lesson is clear. Memory matters. Every time we speak a name, every time we share a story, we deny silence the final word. Rachel's life is remembered because people refuse to let her fade. Perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is that truth does not always arrive when we want it. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it takes decades. That waiting is cruel, but it is not meaningless. Rachel's story teaches us that truth may be delayed, but it is rarely destroyed. This is a difficult lesson, one that families of cold cases know too well. It demands patience, but it also demands hope. Because as Rachel's case proves, truth can wait 30 years and still emerge, still matter, still change everything. Together, these lessons form a single truth. Rachel's case is not just about a crime solved, it is about resilience, awareness, and the enduring force of memory. Rachel's case reminds us that trust can be broken, persistence matters, and truth waits for its moment. Subscribe so you don't turn away from these lessons. If you don't, explain in the comments why you'd rather ignore the stories that warn and protect us. The Whitfields will carry their grief forever, but they also carry the comfort of knowing Rachel's name is remembered. The detectives carry the satisfaction of persistence, but also the weight of time lost. The community carries guilt, but also the resolve to honor her life. And we, as witnesses to her story, carry the responsibility to learn. That is the broader lesson of Rachel's case, that every story has power, and every lesson can prepare us for the unseen. Rachel Whitfield's case is over, but the echoes of it remain. For 30 years, her family carried questions, her community carried trust in the wrong place, and her story waited in silence. Now, with the truth uncovered, her name is no longer tied only to absence. It is tied to persistence, to memory, and to lessons that reach far beyond Georgia. But this is where you, the viewer, come in. Stories like Rachel's are not just meant to be watched and then forgotten. They are meant to be remembered, discussed, and carried forward. That's why this community exists, because memory is power, and silence only helps those who thrive in shadows. If you subscribe, you're not just clicking a button. You're saying Rachel's name mattered. You're saying her decades of silence were not wasted. If you choose not to subscribe, then at least be honest. Type in the comments why you'd rather stand outside the circle of remembrance, because silence here is a choice too. Every subscription is more than a number. It's a voice joining the chorus that refuses to let victims fade. It's one more safeguard against forgetting. And forgetting is exactly what Tristan counted on for 30 years. Think about it. Tristan lived trusted and respected for 3 decades. If that happened once, could it happen again? Wouldn't you rather know, be prepared, and learn from these stories instead of ignoring them? Subscribe so you don't risk being blindsided in your own community. If you won't, say why in the comments, because turning away is still a choice worth explaining. This is not about fear alone. It is about responsibility. Responsibility to the Whitfields, who carried pain for 30 years. Responsibility to Rachel, whose name deserves to be remembered. And responsibility to the countless other families still waiting for their story to find its ending. This channel is built on remembrance. By subscribing, you become part of a community that says, justice may be delayed, but memory will not be denied. If you stay on the outside, then tell us why. Tell us why Rachel's story, and others like it, should not matter enough for your voice to stand with ours. Viewers who comment, who debate, who share their thoughts, you are helping keep these stories alive. Your words ensure that Rachel's memory is not just part of the past, but part of the present conversation. That is the power of community. And so we end Rachel's case with one final thought. Her life mattered. Her story mattered. And now, her memory continues not only in her family's hearts, not only in her community's murals, but here, in the voices of everyone who refuses to forget. We've told Rachel's story. The question now is, will you help carry it? Subscribe if you believe her name deserves to live on. And if you don't leave quietly. Comment below. Tell us why you'd rather walk away from a story that demanded 30 years to be heard,